welcome again, everybody who joined us tonight. I just wanted to give you an overview of what the season was like. It's always something different, and yeah, just give you a taste of what the highlights and the lowlights were at North Lookout this year. So this is our 88th year of counting. We've had a crew of 5 staff and 14 volunteers that counted from August 15th through December 15th, which is um, our typical season. And then we also had one staff member who went up in January just because the winds were good and hoping to catch some eagles. We spent 119 days up on the lookout counting, over 1,100 hours. We counted 16 species of raptors, which it's typical for us. Our count was just over 12,500 raptors that we counted, which is 21% below our 10-year average. And I'll try to get into that why that happened and why we think that happened this year. But we don't just count raptors here at Hawk Mountain. We count everything. So we counted, just over 63,000 non-raptors, which includes 146 species. Most of those are birds, but we also counted butterflies and we counted dragonflies as well. So as I mentioned earlier, this year's count was below average. And the question is, why do we think we saw such a drop in the numbers that we saw this year? Well, in order to kind of figure out, why that drop occurred, we really have to look at what I call the big three. Those are broadwing hawks, sharp-shinned hawks, and red-tailed hawks. There are 3 most abundant migrants, in order. Broadwings are most abundant, sharp-shins, and then red-tails. And these 3 really make up about 80% of our fall count total. So we really have to look at how these 3 species did, how we counted them, and then figure out why we might have seen that drop in the overall count total. So broadwing hawks, our most abundant migrant. We counted just over 5,300 birds. Our high day was just over 1,800 birds on September 15th. And that was a 31% drop in our 10-year average. So, why do we think we saw a lot fewer broadwings than we did previous years? Well, if we look at kind of our count data over the years, we see that on the y-axis you have the number of birds counted and then year on the bottom axis. And you can see that the numbers of broadwing hawks that we're counting each year is highly variable. It varies anywhere from, on average, between 5,000 and 15,000 birds. This high count in 78 is just an anomaly. That was our miracle year when we saw almost 30,000 broadwings. But broadwings aren't just our most variable migrant from year to year. They also have the narrowest window of migration. So you can see this black diamond here. This is the month of September that's shaded. And this is the percent of broadwings that go through on any day in September. So you can see that most of the broadwings, over 99% are going through, in the month of September. And it really peaks usually about mid-September to the 3rd week in September. What happens is the weather during that 3rd week in September really dictates what our broadwing hawk count is going to look like. So this year, this is what our broadwing count looked like. How many broadwings are in this picture? The birds were incredibly high, and we had blue skies. So trying to find a speck in these deep blue skies is really difficult. Not only that, winds can have a big impact on the migration as well of broadwings during that 3rd week in September. If we get easterly winds, birds tend to get shifted more to the west. than they do. But they do come down in visible numbers. So this is that big day where we had over 1,800 broadwings, and this is just kind of the tail end of a large flight that we had over 2 hours where we recorded just over 1,400 broadwings. But this was the typical sky that we saw during that third week in September. Blue skies, and we also had northeast and easterly winds. So that really tend to push birds further to the west. And if we look at migration sites across Pennsylvania, here is Hawk Mountain, this little 31 right here on the Kittatinny Ridge. And if you look at most of the count sites in eastern Pennsylvania, they were all below average. Whereas the watch sites in central Pennsylvania, they were mostly above average. And it was those easterly and south and northeasterly winds that kind of pushed birds, we think, more towards the center of the state. Now, there is one site in the east that had above average counts. This is Little Gap. And the 1,400 birds that we recorded, their big day was the day before. But from talking to the people that were up at Little Gap that year or that day, most of the birds were going straight south. And you can imagine if the birds are going straight south from Little Gap, and by the time they get to about the same latitude as Hawk Mountain, they're about almost 50 kilometers away. So we missed a lot of those birds that Little Gap saw. We just caught really the tail end of their late day flight, and we caught them the next day. So let's look at the next of the big three, sharp-shinned hawks. Our second most abundant migrant. We recorded just over 3,000 of those birds, and their count was low as well. It was about 12% below the 10-year average. And Hawk Mountain wasn't alone. If we look back at other watch sites in Pennsylvania, we can see that most of the sites did have below average counts this year. The blue arrow, obviously, the red arrow down means below average counts. Blue arrow up means above average. And this little yellow horizontal arrows, that just means that it was an average year for those birds. So not only do we see this year a lower count of sharp-shinned hawks, if we look at kind of the counts overall at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, kind of the same graph that I showed for broadwings, we see starting about 1990 or so, a precipitous decline in the number of sharp-shinned hawks that we're counting. And over those 30 years, we're seeing about a 2% decline per year in those sharp-shinned hawk numbers. And if we look just within the last 10 years or so, we're actually seeing a steeper decline for sharp-shinned hawks, about 6% per year. But again, this is only one site. The question would be, how does our site, Hawk Mountain, compare to other sites? Are other sites seeing these similar trends in declining numbers of sharp-shinned hawks? And this map is an analysis done from the Raptor Population Index. So again, these down arrows, the red arrows show significant declines in the number of sharp-shinned hawks that are being counted. The blue dots are where there is no trend. And then this one green arrow in Pennsylvania is where that site had an actual increase in the number of sharp-shinned hawks. So as you can see, in the Northeast, a lot of the watch sites are showing declines in the number of sharp-shinned hawks that they're counting. So the question is, why? We really don't know. This was kind of, when this analysis came out, it was a bit of a shock. But we do think, some potential factors could be habitat loss, contaminants. Sharp-shinned hawks eat small songbirds, so the decline in songbird populations may be a factor. And global climate change may also play a role. Now, the last of the big three is red-tailed hawks. Red-tailed hawks um, we counted just over 1,100 red-tailed hawks. Their numbers were down 20% below the 10-year average. And again, um, most of the sites in Pennsylvania also saw declines in or had counts below their 10-year average. And if we look at Hawk Mountain, we see a similar trend that we did in sharp-shinned hawks over the last 30 years, a steady decline in the number of red-tailed hawks that we're counting. And if we look to that same raptor population index analysis, we see that in the east, about 50% of the hawkwatch sites are seeing a decline in the number of red-tailed hawks that they're counting over the last 10 years, or at least from 2009 to 2019. If there is some good news, and there is some good news with this, if we look at data from Christmas bird count, so counts that are conducted in December time frame, we see that red-tailed hawks are actually increasing sites further north of Hawk Mountain. So in New England, southern Canada. So what's happening is red-tailed hawks are not migrating as far as they used to, or may not be migrating at all. So presumably due to global climate change, their migration patterns have shifted over the last 30 years or so. But unfortunately, those top three are not the only species that were showing below average counts this year. Most notably, this is American goshawk, not northern goshawk now. We only saw 3 goshawks this year. Our average is about 9, so a 75 or 76% decline below the 10-year average for American goshawks. Ospreys, 192 ospreys were counted. Their counts were 32% below the 10-year average. Merlins counted 114. Their counts were about 30% below average. You can see this trend working here. And I won't belabor the point, but 12 out of the 16 species that we counted this year had counts below their 10-year average. But there is some highlights from this year's count. And the big one is bald eagles. We counted 668 bald eagles, which was a record count this year, breaking the count from last year, which was 339. We counted a high of 38 bald eagles on September 23rd, which I think was the 5th highest count ever at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And overall, the count was 24% above average. So this is how we typically see bald eagles late in the season. This was the record-breaking bald eagle. It's just gliding on those updrafts as the northwest winds hit up against the ridge and just effortlessly glide by. So this bird was number 640, setting a new record at the time. They counted, I think, 8 more bald eagles after that, setting again another record. And then, we had some people go up late in the season to add an additional 15 bald eagles. So we ended up with 668, and you can see that the population of bald eagles really crashed in the 70s. And after DDT was banned, we saw almost exponential growth in the number of bald eagles that were being counted. So back in, the counts really bottomed out, I think in 1978 or 1980, where we only recorded 14 bald eagles. And actually, the first year I started at Hawk Mountain, which was 25 years ago in 1999, we had 190 bald eagles, which was a record at the time. And just think about it, 25 years later, we're at 3.5 times that number. Just an incredible conservation success story. And these numbers are being seen at watch sites throughout Pennsylvania. Mostly blue arrows, up arrows. Not sure what's happening in southeastern Pennsylvania. But again, to look at these, we had a down year for a lot of species. We had up years for some species, and it's just one single data point. You really need to look at the long-term data to try and figure out what the population trends are. So a single year isn't necessarily that alarming, especially for bald eagles in the southeastern Pennsylvania. Bald eagles were not the only good news that we had this year. Turkey vultures were well above average, 24% above average, almost 900 counted. These are scavengers that provide a lot of ecosystem services. So it's great to see that turkey vultures numbers were up this year. This was the fourth highest count at Hawk Mountain during the fall. Two species that showed average counts, black vulture and northern harrier, especially northern harrier, who has been showing that species that the counts have shown long-term population or long-term declines in the number that we're counting. So I think, an average count for this year, I'm gonna call that a win, or a highlight anyway. But the real highlight this year was a Mississippi kite seen on October 15th. This is a species that is typically in south central US and southeastern US. And this is only the seventh record that we've recorded a Mississippi kite in the fall. So, I mean, this is one of the exciting things about counting birds in the fall when you start, is that, you just never know, are we going to have what the highlights and lowlights are going to be, or are you going to see something really unusual like a Mississippi kite? But as I mentioned before, we don't count just raptors. We count a lot more non-raptors than we do raptors. So again, over 68,000 non-raptors, and these are our top 5 non-raptors. We had Canada geese, which is by far the number one non-raptor every year. When we have skeins of geese heading south over the ridge in November and December. So we counted just over 14,000 Canada geese, including a day in December where we recorded just under 5,000 in a day. The second most abundant was blue jays, which was kind of surprising. We always count blue jays. I've never seen a count this high, just over 11,500. And I thought for sure this was going to be a record. But when I dug back into the archives, there was actually 1965, they counted over 55,000 blue jays, which to me is just unfathomable. This year was an incredible year. We had one day in September, I think it was, where we counted just over 4,300 blue jays. And the really weird thing about watching blue jay migration is you think about blue jays, they're very vocal most of the time, but when they're migrating, they're completely silent. So seeing a flock of 500 blue jays flat by, being silent is really a sight to see. And then to wrap up the other 3, which are kind of our typical most abundant non-raptors, cedar waxwings, tree swallows, and then common grackles rounded out the top 5. So as I mentioned, we count a lot of non-raptors, and North Lookout can be a fantastic place to see songbird migration in late August and early September, particularly within the first 2 hours of sunset, as birds are settling into the woods and then moving around in the vegetation around the lookout. And we didn't really have a really big year or a big day for many of the songbirds, particularly warblers and vireos. We did have one day with over 90 Blackburnian warblers. But this year we had an incredible diversity. So 25 species of warblers, were recorded at North Lookout this year, including a few rarities that are very unusual for North Lookout. We had a golden wing warbler, a nice male. We also had an orange-crowned warbler, which those numbers or those sightings are few and far between. We also had a great year for woodpeckers as well. For red-headed woodpeckers, yellow-bellied sapsuckers, red-bellied woodpeckers, as well as northern flickers. We had, if not record, near record counts of all of these woodpeckers. What that means, again, I don't know. It's just 1 year's worth of data. But the really cool thing is I'm almost positive it was a red-headed woodpecker record year. We did have one day with 13 red-headed woodpeckers, which is more than I've heard of counted here at Hawk Mountain. Just some other species of note that we saw up at North Lookout this year, a cackling goose. So this picture on the upper left, the cackling goose is on the left and the Canada goose is on the right. So it looks a lot like a really small Canada goose. We do get these occasionally, but not very often. And usually it's a very small, compact goose with a very small bill, flying with a skein of Canada geese. And that's often how we identify them. We also had a red-throated loon, which is unusual. Most of the loons that we see are all commons. But this was one bird that we saw in November. And then snow buntings. We didn't have a lot of snow buntings this year. We do get them every year. But what was unusual is that we had a flock that actually landed on the lookout, giving the counter and any visitors that were there a great look. I do want to make a special note of monarchs. We get monarchs every year. This year we counted 288, which was the second lowest count ever. We have data, good data that goes back 35 years, and it was the second lowest count in the 35 years that we've been documenting my monarch migration this year. So you may have heard that monarchs have been petitioned to be listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So hopefully it's not too late to save that species. So just to wrap up, we counted 68,000 non-raptors, over 12,000 raptors. And this is, I do want to thank all of these folks, our great staff, and our wonderful volunteers who spent countless hours up there in the hot, in the cold, in the fog. So this count could not be done without those, as well as some of our count assistants who refused to go down at the end of the day and wanted to stay a little extra while the counters went down. So I do want to thank them. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions. I will stop sharing. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments?
Yes, I wanted to, well, so first I thank you for sharing this information, but also you mentioned that among the maybe many reasons for the declining of in the numbers was contamination or pollution. What type of pollution do you think might be affecting the migration?
I don't think I mentioned pollution. I know that for sharp-shinned hawks, contaminants, which is it could be something like rodenticides,
Okay.
pesticides may be an influence. That again, that was, it's one of the theories that why we're seeing declines in sharp-shinned hawks. It's one of those species that, as I mentioned, people were shocked when they saw the declines throughout the eastern U.S. And it's a species that needs to be looked at, but nobody has looked at it quite yet. So.
All right. And you mentioned that species primarily feeds on sunbirds, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Had you made countings of sunbirds around the area?
We do count songbirds as they move past the lookout. but we haven't analyzed those data completely yet. I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the next things we plan to do. But we did, there was a paper that came out, I think 5 years ago now that, over, and it was like 5 billion birds have been lost in the last,
Yeah.
50 years. So, and we are seeing declines in some warblers that use the boreal forest in Canada.
Mhm.
So it's certainly possible that could be influencing the decline in the number of sharp-shinned hawks we're counting as well. As opposed to the red-tailed hawks where we're seeing, increases during kind of Christmas bird counts, we're not seeing the same pattern in sharp-shins. So we're fairly confident that the the decline in the numbers that we're counting probably is real and probably due to a
Mhm.
population decline.
All right. Right, this year you had a severe drought, right, around the area that it was like too dry for some months and you didn't have.
It we did have a very dry fall, but I'm not really sure that that really had much of an influence. I think it's for some species it was the weather as far as wind conditions more than anything else. I think is driving a lot of the patterns that we're seeing this year.
All right. Well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Anybody else? Well, again, thank you very much for tuning in. I apologize that this was a little bit late, but hopefully you got a sense of what the count was like this year. And again, this is only 1 year's worth of data. It's really looking at the long-term trends and collecting data over a long period of time that allows us to look at how these populations are faring over the years. So again, thank you for stopping in. It's only if you're in the area, spring migration starts in only 2.5 months, and we will look forward to hopefully seeing you up there. Thanks and have a great night, everybody.